Welcome back to the latest edition of Issues and Interviews with Kieran Lalor on the Hudson Power Broker channel. We are joined by a good friend of mine, a frequent guest, a major media star, was just on Fox and Friends this morning, Dr. Darrin Porcher. Darrin, how are you this morning? Dr. D?
I'm good, but I'm not a good friend of yours. I'm a great friend of yours. And it's a slap in the face that you put me in the purview of everyone else that comes on the show.
Okay. A great friend of mine. And actually, I was just thinking.
That's what I'm talking about.
Exactly,
I got real estate in this thing here, man.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It was 2 years ago that you came up here to Dutchess and spoke at our D-Day event, because today's June 4th and D-Day is June 6th. So,
and more importantly, he foot the bill, ladies and gentlemen. So I came up there, had a great time. The D-Day celebration was amazing. I got the chance to speak from a wholehearted perspective of being an Army officer. And then I got the chance to sit down with you and your family and had a great meal. And I didn't even have to leave a tip. You took care of everything.
As soon as I said I was paying, Darrin ordered the lobster.
Yeah. Two lobsters.
Yeah,
2 lobsters. The 4-pound lobster, I might add.
So by way of background, Darrin Porcher, a U.S. Army veteran, was an officer in the United States Army, a lieutenant in the New York City Police Department. He's Dr. Darrin because he's a professor. Right now he's a professor at Pace University, which is my alma mater as far as my law school. And he's an expert on criminal justice matters. And criminal justice is the big topic. A couple of police officers shot last night in New York City and one stabbed. Give me your thoughts on what's going on right now as far as protests and rioting and everything we're seeing on our TV screens.
Well, we're in the wake of some unfortunate times. And, for years on end, there's been this somewhat cantankerous relationship between police and community. And this thing kind of came to fruition when we look at what happened in the wake of the death of George Floyd. It was an atrocity. This was a classic example of police misconduct, and the criminal justice system is now playing its role in connection with the arrest of the officers and bringing this case to trial. And we should be seeing a grand jury convening relatively soon. I don't think this is going to be hard to introduce a true bill. When I say a true bill, meaning an indictment. And the indictment is merely just enough to go to trial. Oftentimes when people say, oh my God, somebody was indicted, it's the other. No, that just says that, okay, we got the green light to go to trial. But when we go back to the state of affairs through the prism of race, it's been, when you speak to different people, you get different aspects of what race relations are in the United States. And I don't, granted, I'm speaking to this as an African-American male, and granted, has there been inequities throughout the course of time? Sure, there has. But I'm more prone to look through the prism of socioeconomics than race, because oftentimes when you view things through socioeconomics from a global perspective, not just a national perspective, you can see the inequities that are of epic proportions towards the people that are at the bottom of the scale. And so when we look at what's happening in relation to Minneapolis, Minnesota, I believe that this was a riot that started before the actual incident of Mr. Floyd losing his life. There was just a groundswell of animosity against police. And we go back to Eric Gardner a couple of years ago, and there's been a multitude of different cases that involve police misconduct. And I think that this stuff just really came to, it revolutionized, and it just went through the roof. And so now we're dealing with the repercussions of a system that in many ways hasn't been repaired. It's not just the George Floyd case, but it's just a lot of systemic issues attributed to policing. And I can tell you this firsthand. Use of force is always ugly. There's no clean way to look at use of force. So if I showed you a video of an officer that was laying down on the ground and a person blew this officer's head off, and then the officer's partner immediately came from the left side of the screen and shot the person as they were attempting to put more bullets into the officer on the ground, we would still cry outrage based on your vision of the use of force. I understand it. I got it. That will never change. Oftentimes, whenever we have these cases of police use of force or abuse or let's say over policing in certain particular communities. One of the first things is there's a major outrage, and we look to a panel to convene to make an assessment of certain benchmarks that should be implemented in connection with professional development in the police culture. The problem with that is this: I'm all good with us having a tabletop and having an information exchange as in terms of what ideas fit best for police. But there's never really a sustainment piece to it. When I say a sustainment piece, okay, we'll sit down, we'll engage in the tabletop, and the major stakeholders will do what will get their piece in. But then when we move away from that particular incident, 6 months, a year later, everyone forgets about it. And so,
is that what you're saying?
I'm sorry, you broke up. What was that?
Follow through after you.
Right. Yeah. The follow through is something that doesn't come into play. Nor is there a sustainment piece. When I say the sustainment piece, let's do the evaluation. Let's say maybe 6 months later, and based on the what we observed through the evaluation or the assessment phase, now we can retool our strategy to make sure that this is running. We have we're on both sides of the track with this thing. And unfortunately, it's one of these things that since introduced a travesty to us as Americans. And another thing that we have to take in consideration: there's no national police standard. I'm not saying that there should or there shouldn't be. I think it's somewhat a challenge for you to introduce a national police standard, because localized police departments are governed by a local municipality. That local municipality is the recipient of tax revenues. So those tax revenues will determine the resources or logistics that will be introduced to that particular department. I give you an example: a place like New York City, we're going to have far more resources that we can implement into policing in comparison to a place like Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And so you got to, coupled with the laws are different geographically. Therefore, as a result, we need to focus on more geographical strategies for those populations, as opposed to an overarching policy that can impact on everyone in the United States. It's not going to work that way. But in any event, that being said, I'm on the show and I'm so glad to be with my good friend, and let's do it.
We are joined by Dr. Darrin Porcher, criminal justice professor, Army veteran, retired NYPD lieutenant. When I hear the protesters, let's set aside the looters, legitimate protesters who have a First Amendment right. They're exercising their First Amendment right. The George Floyd thing was terrible. I think they have a right to be upset. But their underlying argument is that this is bigger than George Floyd, that there's systematic racism in law enforcement, in your local law enforcement agency, in the NYPD, and around the country. Do you believe there's systematic racism in law enforcement in the United States in 2020?
Well, I think that we have systematic racism throughout society, in particular in a police department. I'm sure that there is. And when you look at the quantitative data, in many instances, it is reflective of that. But I can speak to being a police manager or a prior police manager. You can be a racist, you can be whatever you choose to be outside. But when you come and you sign in that book and you start your tour, I need you to be a police officer. I need you to check your emotions at the door. We have our own personal inhibitions across the board. If I sit down with 10 people and I get into the inner workings of their minds, I'm going to find things that I'm going to be horrified with. But at the same token, these individuals are going to participate in a level of employment such as policing, fire, or any civil service employment. You bring people in, you can't expect to change who they are. But what we can expect is for them to do their jobs. And that's really the issue at hand. Officers that are willing to do their jobs and serve the public appropriately. And then when you mentioned earlier in terms of, systemic issues within our culture, this is never going to change. Don't think for a minute that you can change a person's mindset, but you can change and you can direct the systematic process of how they perform their duties and responsibility. And this is a result of a secure, I shouldn't say secure, but a supervisory matrix that's sound, that ensures that the process runs through the way it should.
So when you, I read statistics, I read articles in the last few days, they say statistically, law enforcement doesn't have deadly interactions more so with African Americans than they do with, say, white people. Are you looking at different statistics than what I'm reading?
No, the statistics that I've seen, believe it or not, you have more Caucasians that lose their life through interactions with police than African Americans. But you also have to take in consideration quantitatively, we have more Caucasians in the United States. We have 365 million people in the United States, and the African American community commits to a small fraction of that. So when you look at it from a percentage perspective, more African Americans do lose their life. But when you look at it, lose their life in connection with police encounters. But when you look at it from the whole number, meaning the total number, you're going to have more Caucasians. But I say this too. Just because just based on a person's race, that doesn't mean that they should lose their life. Like I mentioned to you, Caucasians lose their life far more than African Americans. I think that we want to practice quintessential policing in America. And as a result of that, we want to apply what we refer to as the best practices. One of the things that we see in a revolutionization of policing is we're seeing more and more methods of technological innovations that are being injected into policing that's not using officers as much. And I give you something simple that everyone can see. Traffic cameras. When you implement a traffic camera, it allows us to take pictures of a vehicle that either runs a red light or is speeding. What that does is that reduces the interaction between police and civilians. So that, believe it or not, that cuts down a significant number of those interactions. And then what happens is a lot of people, we all know where these cameras are. And so people will slow down. People are still getting summonses, but we can now use that officer to do different things. In terms of technology, how it further advances the departments, not just the NYPD, but I want to say on a national level, everywhere you go throughout the country, you will see police security cams. And what those police security cams do, they oftentimes will replace the officer that will be set at that location from an omnipresence perspective. These cameras capture images, and if need be necessary, we can deploy an officer accordingly to address whatever the situation is. In addition to that, we have something we refer to as Shot Spotter. Shot Spotter is a relatively new, I want to say over the last 10 to 15 years, a technology that we introduced that whenever a gunshot is recorded, it immediately dispatches police to that location. And so a lot of times we have this different, in many instances, we have this different technology that's coming to the forefront. And what it does is it reduces the police and civilian engagement, because by reducing that engagement, you're going to reduce the level of use of force cases. And we can also use the officers in more germane positions in policing. We're trying the best that we can to get it right. We're never going to be 100%. It's an arduous task, but we need to set forth the benchmarks necessary to get us to a better place.
Dr. Darrin, we have about a minute to go, so I'm going to give you a tough question. I know you can answer in a minute or less, but when I read about the protests and I hear what they have to say, and they say that people in communities of color are afraid of law enforcement. Should they be afraid of law enforcement? Is that a realistic fear?
The communities of color are under siege. No one needs the police more than the people that are in the communities of color. And what really tears me apart is when we look at the riotous behavior in the wake of George Floyd, we have people burning down the very same communities that they live in. And these, in many instances, are the communities of color. It's counterproductive. We need to move forward with a strategy that assists us, not sets us back. And so going back to the people in the communities of color, they need to bridge that symbiotic partnership with police, because ultimately police are the first lines of defense in these communities that keep people safe.
All right, Dr. Darrin, we said a mouthful in 15 minutes there. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us. Usually I wear a t-shirt on this show, but I knew you would be looking sharp, so I classed it up a little bit for you, buddy.
Well, your assistant told me you normally come in commando style, so I don't know. You wearing pants under there? I'm teasing you. Always a sharp guy, man. As always, it's a pleasure coming on, and I relish the opportunity to come on and present.
Good man. Good man. I appreciate your expertise and your insights. Have a great day. Stay safe, buddy.
You do the same. Stay safe. America first.
I like that. I like that. All right.
All right, Paul. All right, bye now.